Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Take two, Craig. Welcome back to the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Yeah, thank you very much, Robbie. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Craig Ciccone. I'm an independent historian based in Highland Park, Michigan. It's a small city inside of Detroit. And my research, I've delved into my research for the last almost 35 years, including a wide variety of subjects. But what we're here to talk about is the JFK assassination, and hopefully we'll also be able to talk about Fred Hampton. So
when it comes to the JFK assassination, would you like to tell everybody a little bit about where your research focuses?
Absolutely. My contribution to the JFK case, amongst the thousands and thousands of books that have already been written, is a database of eyewitnesses to the assassination. Now, that might be a little misnomer because they're not actually eyewitnesses. I have also cataloged all of the people who were in the entire motorcade, vehicle by vehicle, including the motorcycles, including the pilot car, which was the first car, and then the advanced car was the first car, the pilot car was the last car, and people who may or may not have heard something. So I wanted to include as many witnesses as I could possibly find, and it's been a 30-year odyssey to do that. The advances in technology has helped because collections of interviews that the law enforcement did and the government did is now available online. So that really helped me. So what I call the master list of witnesses, it's a book. It's a over 100-page book, cataloging as many witnesses as I could find, their occupation, where they were standing or sitting, who they were with, if they were with anybody, and their impressions of the shots that they heard, plus any other interesting tidbits about the eyewitness or about their statements that they made or the testimony that they gave to the Warren Commission or the depositions. And then included with that is a 24 by 36 map of Dealey Plaza that was done by an architect friend of mine. And on that, I plot all of the witnesses and as many cars in the motorcade as I could fit, because it doesn't really show all of Main Street, right? It's just that top of the pear shape of Dealey Plaza that's on my map. But I think it shows about 345 witnesses, and my list catalogs about 412 witnesses.
Was it surprising to you the number of films? I only knew about the Zapruder film, but then if you look up like the actual number of, and it makes sense, the number of people that were probably filming that day, that event, the president's coming by. Were you able to look at those videos and then pinpoint exactly where those people were located on your map?
Well, that's an excellent question, because one of the problems with the interviews that law enforcement did, whether it was in 1963, 1964, or even when the House Select Committee on Assassinations investigated the assassination, their interviews of the witnesses were very vague, and either they didn't have the time or the willingness to extract more information from these witnesses or to clear up any vagaries that were in their statements, like where they were standing. That's one of the main focuses of inconsistencies. So whether they interviewed a witness on the street or back at FBI at the field office in the FBI's field office, or the Dallas Police office, or the sheriff's office, it doesn't matter where they were, unless the law enforcement officer or the interviewer actually took them to the place that they were standing in Dealey Plaza and say, show me where you were standing. There really was no way to pinpoint it other than their verbal recollection of where they were. So they would say things like 75 feet west of the Texas School Book Depository, or the intersection of Houston and Elm. You know what I mean? So 25 feet, 30 feet, even sometimes I even used yards. So then I have to convert that. So the plotting of the witnesses, the vast majority of them is guesswork. It's the best available evidence that I have based on what they said. Now, sometimes it helps because they went in groups. This was at lunchtime, so a lot of people went out of the buildings that were in Dealey Plaza and stood together. So if one person didn't say where they were, a person they were with gave that information. So again, it's that trying to whittle down the best available evidence that I have, and if I could confirm their location and identity on films or photographs, that's the most optimal. The Zapruder film certainly did it because the footage of the advanced motorcycles that Zapruder used to test his film out before the motorcade appeared and turned onto Elm Street, that gave us a wonderful look at the north side of Elm and all of those people, most of whom were from the Texas School Book Depository, employees of the Texas School Book Depository. Wonderful shot of them, and they are easily identified because of what they were wearing. So over the years, there have been many researchers who have actually located those people and interviewed them and showed them pictures of the stills of the Zapruder film and asked, can you find yourself? And a lot of them did. So it's been that try to piece together all of those different variables to try to locate witnesses or put them in the most reasonable position that they were in.
Is it difficult for you to look through some of these witness testimonies? I feel like from what I've heard from a memory expert, the only time you can ever remember something that's traumatic is usually if you have like some type of war experience or you've been in combat before, because when shots are going off, you're able to think about, be able to assess your situation, which I find it weird that if you look at the colorized photos of when the shots were going down, you see the media camera guys right up on John Newman's face or whoever those people are that are lying down on the ground and they're just taking photos. I'm like, is nobody panicking that there's shots being fired right now?
No, they were taking pictures of people panicking. But when you're a journalist, especially a photojournalist, back in those days, those guys just had an innate sense of, okay, something's happening, I've got to shoot it, no matter the danger to myself. I've got to record this. I've got to, for posterity. They were just doing their jobs and did it very well, but they were filming the people who were actually panicking. But excellent point. I mean, how much can we rely on eyewitness testimony? Not that much. But I guess the good thing is that there were so many witnesses. The House Select Committee on Assassinations claimed that they were able to locate. And when I say locate, I don't know what that means because they were very unspecific in what they meant. But 694 witnesses. So is that you interviewed them, you found them, you identified them through photographs, or you simply counted the number of bodies that you could see along any given point with the photographs and the films? They didn't make that clear. So when you have such a group of witnesses like that, you take the largest common denominator instead of individual eyewitnesses, like the Warren Commission tried to do with any number of people. Howard Brennan was their star witness, and he turned out to be completely unreliable, not because he didn't have good memory, but because, well, he wasn't in the place that he said he was. We could actually see that in the Zapruder film and other films. So he exaggerated certain things and was inconsistent, but that goes to eyewitness testimony. So you take as many eyewitnesses as you can and the largest common denominator, and you try to see, the patterns in what they say, or in fact, because we have film, what they did. One of the most compelling arguments for additional shots, other than the Texas School Book Depository, is the direction that people ran, including law enforcement officers. So these are people who are trained. Granted, they are not expecting gunfire at this point, not just in history, but they just weren't expecting it. But the fact that there was a cooperative movement of witnesses that lends itself to looking harder at or more critically, at those witnesses who said that they thought shots came from either behind the grassy knoll, over by the triple underpass, or anywhere else. So we don't rely on eyewitnesses to prove or disprove something. We use it in conjunction with other evidence to make a case.
Well, it's the lone nutter question is if there were shots coming from the grass, why were people running towards an active shooter? It's like, what is that? It's like, well, there's a parking lot there. Maybe they were running to their cars. I mean, I feel like with Dealey Plaza, the amount of echoes that were going on, I've seen statements from people saying shots came from the knoll, shots came from the building. I would have to think that the people that heard shots come from the sixth floor of the building probably started running towards the knoll because it's away from the Texas School Book Depository. But then you got the people that also heard. I mean, people are hearing shots all over the place. One person said they heard it from like a sewer, and it's just like, I don't know, I can't get there. But I look at it like, if a cop is running towards the knoll, the cop is not running away from the gunfire. His job would be to investigate into that. So that just means maybe they felt safer if a cop was with them. That maybe the cop. So there's like a lot of confusion there.
But no, you're absolutely right. There could very well have been some witnesses who were actually running to their cars, because part of Dealey Plaza, the southern part of Dealey Plaza on Commerce Street, it was a parking lot basically. They had stopped all traffic, so people were actually had their cars parked on, well, even Main Street on the other side of the triple underpass. But people could have been running to their cars. Certainly, the employees of the Texas School Book Depository who used the parking lot behind the picket fence on the grassy knoll as a parking lot, they could have gone to their cars. But I think for a majority of them, it was fight or flight, and I think for a lot of them, it was a fight. They were looking to try to trap someone or to see what they could see, without any concern for their own safety. I just think it was an automatic reflexive reaction. And luckily they did, because what did those police officers and those witnesses find when they went behind the picket fence? Secret Service agents flashing their credentials. When we know that all of Kennedy's Secret Service detail was in the motorcade, in cars going to Parkland Hospital with the wounded president. None of them jumped like the photographers. None of them jumped out of their cars and started chasing people or trying to track down witnesses. No, they were in the motorcade and they were gone. So there were no Secret Service agents there.
There was a lot of weird things about the motorcade. There should have been a vehicle in front of the president's vehicle that was a press vehicle that should have been filming, because usually they get a front shot that way, and there wasn't one right there. So as soon as the shots went off, he could immediately just speed right to the hospital, which I think is, I mean, people would say, oh, it's because they changed routes. I was like, yeah, but they had that route published a couple days before. Like, it wasn't just like a spontaneous, oh, we're going to take a left right down here. There's no way.
Right. Right. Now, there were cars in front of Kennedy's limousine, but they were advanced cars. The car that I think Forrest Sorrells, who was the head of Secret Service, was in, and I think it was Jesse Curry, the chief of police, was in the pilot car in front of the in front of the presidential limousine. But you can see in some of the press photos pointing towards the triple underpass, when Clint Hill was getting on the back of the limousine, there's a still shot. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with it. And it shows the pilot car underneath the triple underpass. So there was quite a distance between that pilot car and Kennedy's limousine. But it was basically just to radio back to Secret Service agents in the back of President Kennedy what was happening, if something needed to be cleared out or, moved or what have you. It was more of a security thing.
Did you find
But
it
yeah,
weird?
he did have vehicles in front of him.
Did you find it weird that when you look at the Zapruder film, Jackie Kennedy, when she jumps on the back, she seems like she doesn't go that far back. But then when you look at the Nix film makes it seem like she went a lot farther back, which is, I know people bring up the example like the Zapruder film was edited. And trust me, I've stayed agnostic on that. But then when I see the other
I
films,
recommend you do that. Continue to be agnostic when it comes to the Zapruder film.
when I see the other films, and then I look at like my buddy Mike Griffith point this out to me. He's like, if you watch the boy in the back next to his father, he's behind his father. Then not even a split millisecond, he's beside his father clapping like so fast, like it's inhumanly possible to like slow it. So I mean, it makes a little bit of sense there, but that's the thing, is like those other angles of those other films really add another perspective into that. And I would think, I mean, I remember bringing up an example that someone's camera was taken.
Oh, many people's camera were probably taken.
So I mean, that's a that's I well, you can't say anything. You can't make an excuse for that. That's just suspicious as hell.
Absolutely. And you know, you talk about the Zapruder film, the whether or not you believe that it was altered or it was the, you know, that it is the original film that was taken, or that it was spliced to death. The fact that even if it was a pristine, even if we knew and verified that it was the authentic thing and nothing had been done to it to tamper with it or to change it or alter it, the fact that we rely so much on a silent film, the Warren Commission did, or the FBI did, in order to establish shots. How do you establish an audible with a silent film? So, okay, they had to look at the reactions of the men in the car and the women in the car, but that's all subjective. Because I'm one of the people who believe that Connolly wasn't really showing signs of being hit until 273, which is right before Kennedy's headshot. You know, so it's all subjective and it's all interpretation of what you're looking at because there is no sound. So we cannot establish with the Zapruder film all that much. Even less so if we don't believe its veracity. If we don't believe that it is what, in fact, Abraham Zapruder shot that morning.
I
So
got one question about the motorcade, and I got another one about the school book depository. But when it comes to the motorcade, where was Lyndon Johnson's vehicle, or where was he sitting in the motorcade?
he the mayor's car, because he was in, no, I'm sorry, he was in the vice presidential car, which is right behind President Kennedy's Secret Service car. So you've got the presidential motorcade, you've got the Secret Service car, then you've got the car with Lyndon Johnson in it.
I think people put a lot that
He was
Lyndon.
2 cars behind Kennedy.
I think people put a lot that Lyndon Johnson orchestrated the plot. I don't think that. What I do think is he definitely part of the cover up, sure. But when it comes to, you wouldn't sit your car right behind President Kennedy if you were going to have a shooter trying to take him out. I mean, you're sitting in a car with your wife, and even if it was a bubble top, those bubble tops weren't bulletproof. The whole point of the bubble top would deter shooters from shooting at it because most people thought it was bulletproof, and it wasn't.
Yeah, well, if the bubble top had gone on, at least it would have impeded someone's view of the occupants in the motorcade. And unless you knew ahead of time where they were going to be sitting, I mean, you knew Secret Service agents were going to be in the front, but who's in the jump seats and which side? Because through his tour of Texas, they didn't always sit the Conleys in front, the Kennedys in the back, the men on the right, the women on the left. They didn't always do that. So at least the bubble top would have, like I said, it would have prevented someone from seeing who was where.
When you're placing and you're kind of looking at the motorcade and you're recreating the whole scenario, did you look at other motorcades to see if there was anything that was a little bit different besides the bubble top? Like I know they had Kennedy's family physician, like 4 cars at the back of it. And it's like, didn't he have some type of medical condition? If he would have got a cut or something, he'd have to be hit with like a steroid shot or something.
Well, he was already receiving daily uh, cortisone steroid shots. But I don't know that his physical condition would have required that kind of immediate attention. Of course, Dr. Berkeley traveled with him all the, everywhere he went, and he also had 2 other physicians who were in different cities or being brought into different cities where he would arrive for those treatments, not only for his back but also his Addison's disease. So, but no, I and I'm not aware of any. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, because, like I said, there are thousands and thousands of books on the assassination. If there has ever been a study of other motorcades, whether it's dignitaries from other countries, certainly they've mentioned De Gaulle before, and what happens during a De Gaulle motorcade, just in a general way, not specific days where we could say on this day his motorcade looked like this. Why didn't Kennedy's? But it is undeniable that on November 26, 1963, many of the basic security principles, if not rules, were absolutely broken, or norms were not followed. And one of them being, of course, the president and the vice president traveling together, which is why after the assassination, it is now, well, not illegal, but it is forbidden that the president and the vice president traveled together. Because you remember that Johnson's Secret Service agent was really the only one who well, besides Clint Hill, acted in a protective way. He jumped over the seat onto Lady Bird Johnson and Ralph Yarborough, right onto to Johnson, and that's how they rode all the way to Parkland Hospital. Johnson gets out of his car and he's holding his arm because a 200 and some pound Secret Service agent just landed on him. People who were at Parkland thought he had been shot too. So, so from a security standpoint, it was absolutely ridiculous and uh, indefensible that they not only traveled together, but they also traveled 2 cars apart.
Well, there was 3 future presidents in Dallas at that day, and Nixon was at a bottling convention signing babies and kissing foreheads.
Or was he?
I'm just kidding. No,
Maybe he was in the sewer grate. I don't know.
When it comes to a normal procedure that should have been done after that incident just happened and Kennedy's getting rushed to Parkland Hospital, the area should have been cordoned off. Was there anything that you started to, I mean, did you trace what was going on? I know you mentioned people taking vague statements and things of that sort. I'm only guessing because we said this in the last time, which was that they probably thought the FBI or somebody was going to do a more thorough investigation when honestly, a kid with a freaking camera could have did a better job than any of the investigation into that.
No, absolutely. Well, part of the problem was that you still had the rest of the motorcade vehicles to follow and to get out of Dealey Plaza before they, in fact, could cut everything off. As I said, Commerce Street and even some areas close to Dealey Plaza on Main Street had people's personal cars parked there. So while the rest of the motorcade procession is trying to get through Dealey Plaza to follow the president, they didn't know at that point where he was going, but they were just trying to catch up. All of the chaos that we've already talked about. You've got photographers and journalists jumping out of their moving cars to take pictures, right, and to write things down, but then realizing that, hey, we got to go to Parkland Hospital. The car is taking off, so they're running alongside the car, jumping into the car. So that just creates even more chaos. So I think that allowed for traffic to continue to go through Dealey Plaza, and because of the sheer shock of what had happened and the unexpected, that it was completely unexpected. I just don't think the police were ready for it, and so did not do a good enough job to cordon off the area, to stop traffic from flowing, to get as many men deployed down there as possible, the communication immediately to direct what's going to be happening. Okay, we need to have a search of all of the buildings. We need to have a grid by grid search of the north and the south knolls. We need to take as many witness statements as possible. None of that was done. And in some aspects you can blame simply just the chaos of the situation. But as things died down and calmed down, some of the other discrepancies and unprofessionalism can't be so easily dismissed.
Yeah, like the Harper fragment wasn't found until either it was a day later or a couple days later, and it was
No, the next morning, Saturday morning. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big miss if you're missing a giant skull fragment. Like nobody's paying attention.
That's a huge miss. That's a huge miss. So
when it comes to Lee Bowers, do you trust her?
Him?
Or him? That's a him? Is it sounds, I don't know. I've never seen her face. I've only read the name. I just picture it's a girl.
No, Lee Bowers Jr. was the radio or the signal man for the railroad tracks that went over the triple underpass. So he was in a basically a tower. It looks like a small shack or a building. It was a 2-floor thing, and he's on the top and he's looking out the windows, of course, that you can see all the way around, watching the trains come and go and radioing to the engineers and things like that. So he had a perfect view of the Elm Street extension, which is the little street in front of the Texas School Book Depository that led right into the parking lot where all the cars were. than of course the trains themselves. So he had a perfect view of everything that was behind the scenes, and I think his testimony is absolutely compelling. Unfortunately, he died under mysterious circumstances in 1966, so we could not further question him, because if you read his testimony, which I do talk about in my book, or I highlight in my book, the questioning was simply it was they had no intention of really wanting to find out what he saw, because whenever he gave an answer that was contrary to what they had already established, that is the Warren Commission and the FBI, then they either cut him off, changed the subject, or didn't allow him to go back and expound upon it. Actually, the scene was also portrayed in JFK, where Jim Garrison, late at night, is reading the testimony in the 26 volumes of the Warren Commission, and he's reading Lee Bowers's testimony. And he says, ask the question, ask the question. And of course, they never asked the question. So I think, given his consistency in his statements, as few as they were, and the fact that's really all we have, there's no reason not to trust his testimony of seeing three men driving through the parking lot. One of them seemed to have a microphone up in front of his mouth, or his seeing people by the fence and his description of them, saying it looked like he had a rifle in his hand. So there's no reason that I've ever seen that would give us pause about his testimony.
When you're looking at testimonies, who do you trust more that did, I guess, a proper job at getting answers from witnesses? I'm pretty sure through the Warren Commission, you can tell that a lot of witnesses were kind of being nudged for answers or pushed in a certain direction, and they never asked like the serious questions, like you mentioned. But even the House Select Committee on Assassinations, they just gave up when immediately when there was a roadblock in front of their face. If there was like, I don't recall, it was like, okay, well, I'm not going to go down this avenue anymore. It's like, well, hang on a second, ask again.
Absolutely. It was that same kind of thing. It was that same, whether they were pressed for time, they didn't have the money or the budget to prep these witnesses, to even allow these witnesses to read their previous statements or testimony, to see if there any inaccuracies from 1963, 64. I'm really not familiar with HISCA's staff and how they address the eyewitnesses. That is, we don't have the same kind of testimony of eyewitnesses that we had with the Warren Commission, even though that was, that was completely insufficient, given how many witnesses we had. The Warren Commission didn't depose or interview very many of them, but at least we had the transcripts of their testimony and or depositions. That wasn't the case with HISCA. So I'm not familiar with, what they were trying to do. Were they simply trying to find new witnesses, which apparently they did, 694? That's a lot of witnesses. But these either staff reports or papers, working papers, I haven't seen them.
Did you listen to my episode with Blakey? Because
no, I did not.
When I started looking back into what he was saying, he kept saying, you got to understand, what I was hired to do was to keep the credibility of the people that died as if they were alive, and like keep that name intact. And he kept saying it to me. And I look at the HSCA, when I looked at them, I told him, I was like, I don't think they gave you a chance. Like, the way that they were using you was more like a second run through of being like, hey, see, we did a second investigation. It was all good. Because if you look at it, I mean, there were so many aspects of embarrassing the agency. You see that in the 2021 release of documents with Garrison. There's a straight up document that says Garrison's attempt to embarrass the agency. Now, I've never talked about Garrison. I've never went into Fletcher Prouty. I've never went into Ruth Payne or any of that type of stuff, besides talking to maybe Max Good on my show. But there's just these things that are extra and you don't need to see it. But what I can point to is when an agency says attempts to embarrass us, that is a dangerous thing. And from studying other political assassinations, which I'm sure I'll have you back on to talk about MLK and RFK at some points, but Fred Hampton, RFK, MLK, you start realizing that like there's this area of secrecy and what they're deeming it to be secret. What is that? But when an agency says your investigation into trying to find the truth might embarrass us or make us look bad, well, now I'm not only suspecting that you're hiding something, I also think that you're probably going to, Clinton me. You're going to kill me. That's going to happen. I mean, I'm not saying that's what happened, but I'm just saying that's not a good thing when you're looking at members or citizens of the United States of America who the government's supposed to work for us. And you're looking at it like they're looking at you like a security risk. Now, what how many things did they label in other countries that were security risks that ended up being dealt away with? So when you look at that as your own population or the civilians you're supposed to be protecting, even other fellow law enforcement, and then you look at the eyewitnesses and the numbers that died in mysterious circumstances, you start to look at it like, all right, this might not be so conspiratorial.
Yep. It's just the overall handling of the investigation from the FBI, which the Warren Commission relied upon to do their investigative work, because obviously the Warren Commission, the members themselves, aren't going to be doing ballistics tests or toxicology tests or things like that. So obviously they rely on the FBI. The problem is the FBI already had a preconceived conclusion and submitted their report 2 weeks after the assassination. They were still interviewing people in August of 64. So how you can hand over a report that then the Warren Commission will base its entire investigation, staff investigation, and writing the report on is beyond me. It shows that it was a preconceived notion, much like Blakey. Our job is to make sure that the American public knows that we're still in control, that a foreign agency was not responsible and is about to invade us. Because again, think about the time, the context of the time, and people fearing Russia, Cuba, any number of entities, because we had made enemies at that point. And so their job was to placate and to make the American public feel safe. That was their mandate. And the fact that Blakey said pretty much the same, not the same thing, but I'm saying his mandate has nothing to do with the truth or getting at the truth. That the legacy, the memory, the tragedy and trauma that the Kennedy family has gone through is worthy of or necessitates that pursuit of the truth, regardless of what happens to our intelligence agencies, or whether or not they're embarrassed, or whether or not they won't get the same appropriations, or God forbid that they even be shut down because of illegal activity. I mean, that's what it comes down to, I think, is that it's the preservation of these agencies. They don't want to be embarrassed because, well, that will then alter people's perceptions of their invincibility or their necessity even. So
I think bringing the agencies into question about what about their covert action and all these types of things that start going on. I
well,
think
that's what the church committee did in 1975.
I know I've read the whole report. It's amazing.
Absolutely. And that was long overdue. That is holding these agencies to account for what they do in the name of the public, of the American people. So yeah, it is what they do in our name behind closed doors with how did you get that money and what are you doing with it? That's been a concern for a very long time. And
Well, you have these people that, defend the Warren Commission, or they say that everything was okie dokie and it was just one lone agent. Well, I had Blakey say that Oswald was intelligence. Thank God. That was good to get him on record saying that, which I mean, I think the number of documents, like I said, I think he was trying, but I also think he knew to play ball. Like, I mean, he is a government worker as well, too. But when you look at the people that defend the Warren Commission, there are some things you look at where it's like, okay, that makes a little bit of sense, but there's a lot that doesn't. And when you start seeing the people that defend it, it's like, what are you defending? And it's like, are they people trying to protect or be these patriots? I'm a patriot at heart, but I also want to correct evil and know where that lies. And I think when you look at what this isn't just about embarrassing the agencies anymore, or transparency. This is an aspect that nobody is ever going to believe a single word that any of these organizations say ever. We already basically don't in a lot of aspects, but this is like the whole house of cards falls. People are going to start going through your whole books of every historical event and see if it's an assassination or if it's some type of coup that the American government was part of.
I think one of the most important points that Oliver Stone gave voice to in JFK is when he had Jim Garrison say to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, that a popular, beloved president can be murdered in front of his wife in the middle of the day on a public street, and the foundations of our government scarcely tremble. Is a foreign concept. That is, if the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, if they can allow that to happen and allow to squander their one chance at getting the investigation right, and yet nothing happened to them. Kennedy's dead. They move merrily on. They, in fact, get even more powerful. They are given more money to either fight the Vietnam War or to fight dissidents at home or what have you. The foundations of our government scarcely trembled. I think that's an excellent way of putting it. And what does that tell you about what the motive of the intelligence agencies are in investigating things that might make the government or themselves look culpable in the very things that they are investigating? I think that's what we have to keep in mind. And of course, 63, 64, just like Dulles said, that people don't read, that we can get away with this. Basically, we can get away with publishing a 900-page report, 26 volumes of testimony and exhibits without an index, without any rhyme, reason, or order. The reason we can do that is because no one's going to read it. We can give the appearance that, oh, look what we did, look how thorough we were, but confident that no one's going to read it. And that even the academics that do read it, even the academics that come out and say, hey, wait, there's something wrong here, because we've got cross sections of Oswald's pubic hair in here. We've got Jack Ruby's mother's dental records from 1938. What the fuck is going on? No one's going to listen to them because what? They're academics. Because you don't understand this. So you got to realize that the Kennedy assassination took place at the perfect time. That is, it was before Watergate. So what should have been a watershed moment, we had to wait another 10 years before we realized the extent of the power and the power grab that can bring down a president, bring down an agency, or try to bring down an agency, when the Church Committee investigated the FBI and the CIA for their covert and overt operations. I mean, it took the Senate committee to bring out the fact that the CIA had used the mafia doing their bidding in some of the things that they wanted to do. And of course, the FBI with COINTELPRO and usurping so much power and violating so many countless people's civil rights and human rights during that time. It took a long time for someone to have the sack to be able to investigate them and say, this is what our government has done. And yet the FBI is still there. The CIA is still there, right? I mean, very few changes have been made, either in how much money they get, or their oversight, or being accountable for what they've done over the years.
If I had a time travel machine, I would go back in time to Lee Harvey Oswald and be like, hey, before you order that rifle, I want you to look at a straight razor or something. Take care of the downstairs before you start doing all this type of stuff so they don't got nothing on you. That's a joke. Obviously, I don't believe Oswald did it. But back to, because I know you studied the assassination of Fred Hampton, and I know that's what you wanted to talk about as well too, because that is where a lot of your work is also invested in, and it's a topic I'm recently new to after speaking with Jeffrey Haas about it. And if you wanted to give me everyone out there listening who's going to probably listen to this episode because it's JFK related, but did you want to give a breakdown of the Fred Hampton assassination real quick, and then we could talk about it a little bit?
Well, yeah, I recommend, I suggested to you that we talk about Fred Hampton, not only because I've been, studying his life and his assassination for 30 years, but also because of the recently released Shaka King film called Judas and the Black Messiah, which profiles Fred Hampton and one of the FBI informants who had infiltrated the Black Panther Party. His name was William O'Neill. So it was obviously introducing people to Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party, but then also the story of William O'Neill and how his role as an informant led indirectly to Fred Hampton's death. But Fred Hampton is one of the underrated, unsung heroes of the Black liberation movement of the 1960s. He started in his hometown of Maywood, Illinois, which is on the west side of Chicago, in high school. The first reports that we have of the police looking into this young man was 1966. So when he was 19 years old, just out of high school, they've started a police intelligence file on him. The FBI soon follows in 1967, putting him on the rabble rouser index. That this is the kind of person who's going to agitate um, um, protests and to persuade people to challenge the status quo and to improve the lives of people in his community. So he always had a sense of community. He always had a sense of his people and of injustice. He himself very interested in the law, actually taking pre-law classes once he got out of high school, and he was evolving in his philosophy of his political philosophy, his economic philosophy. So he goes from uh, being a very effective organizer of the youth in Maywood for the NAACP, starting and growing a youth branch of the NAACP in Maywood, to embracing Black nationalism and befriending Stokely Carmichael, who was one of the originators of a Black Power, of the Black Power slogan, and more of the Black nationalist philosophies. And then, of course, being introduced into the Black Panther Party, which took a more Marxist view or socialist view, that it wasn't a matter of race, it was a matter of class, it was a matter of economics, that it doesn't matter if you're Black or white, if you're poor, you're going to get shit on. You're going to be, you're going to be thrown in jail. You're going to be shot at or abused by the police. So he was evolving in his philosophies. But as the deputy chairman of the Black Panther Party in Illinois, which he co-founded with Bobby Rush, he was incredibly successful. So he starts at a very limited level in his high school, Proviso East High School in Maywood. Then he moves on to Maywood as a community itself, the entire city, where he's negotiating between students, parents, schools. He's being asked to mediate meetings between Blacks and whites, or to have recreation center being put into Maywood, because of course in the summer a lot of inner city or predominantly Black neighborhoods didn't have the same kind of resources that white communities did. And then, of course, if they tried to go into those white communities to enjoy a swim or a basketball game or anything, they, of course, were ostracized and physically and verbally abused. So these are the kinds of things that he championed on a very local level. Then, of course, when he had a vehicle like the Black Panther Party that was very much into community programs, feeding children before they went to school, clothing drives, free health clinics, free busing programs to the people who had been in prison or unjustly, denied parole and awaiting trial. So they, which of course is a problem we still have today, which is the irony just is sickening. he had a platform now. He had more of a statewide platform in which to help his community and the surrounding communities, eventually taking it not only to the state of Illinois, but also other states. He was considered the Midwest or regional leader of the Black Panther Party because he was making trips to Detroit, he was making trips to New York to help other branches and chapters follow the same kind of disciplinary line that he was, same organizational line, and it was incredibly successful to the point where the national leadership recognized what he was doing on a state and coast-wide level. And when the leadership found themselves in their own problems, that is, the top four members of the National Black Panther Party, Huey Newton had been in jail since 1967 for killing an Oakland police officer. So the Minister of Information or the Minister of Defense was in prison. The chairman, Bobby Seale, he had just recently been arrested for the Chicago Eight. He was part of the Chicago Eight, being blamed for the quote unquote riot that happened during the Democratic National Convention in August of 1968. He's in jail. And then the Minister of Information, Eldridge Cleaver, was in exile in Algiers. So that means that the fourth in line, which was their chief of staff, his name was David Hilliard, he and Fred met several times and discussed that if David Hilliard was confronted with legal problems that would either see him join Cleaver in Algiers, or if you had to go to prison, that Fred Hampton would take over. And if Fred had had a national platform, then I think he would have been even more dangerous at that age when he was only 21, and would have created coalitions on a nationwide level, just like he had on a local level. His Rainbow Coalition, which unified and gave political purpose to otherwise street gangs, and I put those in quotes. He did that very successfully in Chicago, working with dozens and dozens of organizations. He would have done so on a national level. I think the Black Panther Party would have survived a lot longer. I think it would have been, he would have brought the same kind of success that he had to Illinois. And ultimately, I believe that's why he was murdered.
This might be speculation, but do you think that he was caught, or he started being surveillanced, I guess, on an aspect of not only the things that he was doing in the communities, or do you think it was the people that he was making connections with? I have to feel like if they're already observing the Black Panther Party and certain other individuals, then they must have seen him and started to trace him and realize that now he's going, because there are people in our history that are great speakers. They're fluent talkers. They can rile up a population with a power of passion that is dangerous for the government. It is something that they see and they get mad at.
Absolutely, and especially in Chicago, when you have the machinery, the democratic machinery of Dealey. He mentioned Hampton specifically about the successes that the Black Panther Party was having in programs that the city themselves should have taken care of. And that is exactly what Hampton's point was. One of the philosophies was to heighten the contradictions and to let people know, and to let the community see those contradictions. So the city officials say, oh, we'll take care of you. We got your back. And of course, they never do. Things just keep getting worse. People still keep getting poorer. Schools keep deteriorating. Housing projects keep going up and keep being, growing into dilapidation. But then here comes the Black Panther Party, who's working with other community organizations for political awareness, for options that you can have to be fed, to be clothed, to go to school. They were doing what the city should have done and pledged to do, but never did. And that kind of success was pissing off the Dealey machine. So that's why Dealey himself then had to get the agencies within the city who were working for him, like the state's attorney's office, like the attorney general of the state of Illinois, to investigate, surveil, to try to disrupt any way they could Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party, because, you know, the FBI tried to use the same kind of thing against groups like the Black Panther Party, but in Chicago it didn't work. That is, one of their modus operandi, the FBI, is to try to, if you have rival groups, you try to instigate them even more. You try to get them even more pissed off at each other.
Agent provocateurs.
Well, yeah, but you don't even need an agent to do it. They did it through anonymous letters that they would send to Jeff Fort, who was the leader of the Blackstone Rangers, which was the rival group in Chicago against the Black Panther Party, and then letters to Fred Hampton, bad mouthing each other. And so it looks like, or it's supposed to have looked like, Jeff Fort was bad mouthing Hampton, Hampton was bad mouthing Fort, and if all this tension came to a head, they would just kill each other off, and the FBI, you know, FBI just had, you know, sit back and let it happen. That's what they were trying to antagonize rifts that were already there, and then, you know, no culpability. But it didn't work. Fred Hampton was entirely too smart for that. Did they have shootouts? Well, technically, yes, and that's for another that's for another podcast. But there was a truce between Hampton and Fort. And of course, Hampton unifying other groups in Chicago to be more productive, to be less destructive. And that was really upsetting the status quo, the power structure of the status quo in Chicago. And again, that's why so many things were working against Hampton and the Black Panther Party. But every time the FBI or the Chicago police raided their headquarters, doesn't matter how many times they burned their stash of Black Panther Party newspapers or donations that the Black Panther Party received every single day in clothing or food. It doesn't matter how many times they would pull over Panther cars to harass them, to confiscate whatever was in the car, of course, for their intelligence division. It doesn't matter. The community rallied behind the Black Panther Party, kept giving donations of food, money, clothes. It was quite impressive, the effect that the Black Panthers and Fred Hampton specifically had on the west side of Chicago.
Again, another speculation question, but do you think that the whole arrested charges on stolen ice cream or things of that sort were a way of kind of being like, hey, if you go any farther, bad things are going to happen to you? I mean, they're trumped up charges, you could say. I mean, but that's the thing, was this is kind of like a warning to you of like, don't do anything. And then once they saw he wasn't going to stop, I mean, do you think that the plot came from the FBI, or do you think the plot came out of Chicago police?
Both, because they were cooperating with each other. The higher ups knew each other, had come through law school together, or had worked at you know, some either for some judge together or some office together, some bureaucratic office together. But back to your point, one of the FBI's objective was to raise the height of paranoia in this country to the point where, and J. Edgar Hoover said this himself, that he wanted people in America to think that there was an FBI agent luring behind every single post office box. You know, the letter boxes, you know, the mailboxes that were on the street, that was ubiquitous back in the 60s and are no longer in existence today.
Yeah, payphones are gone too, we know.
Well, yeah. So, but Hoover wanted that impression, or wanted people to be so afraid of the FBI that people would think that there's an FBI agent hiding behind every one of those things, like a dumpster or you know, telephone booth or a mailbox, because that was exactly the kind of
Surveillance state.
Surveillance state and technique that they used. So if you attended a meeting of, say, even something like even the NAACP, you just wanted to go to a meeting. A friend of yours had said, hey, you know, Roy Wilkins is going to be in town and he's speaking at this library. Hey, you want to come? Yeah, sure. I'll come hear him speak. The FBI taking down the license plates of everybody in the parking lot or on the street. Now the net that the FBI used to be able to try to intimidate people, to try to prevent people from being um, become members of these kinds of groups, that's exactly what they would do, is that they would say, we know you were at this meeting, but do you realize what this organization stands for or what they might do? And look, if you knew that the FBI was on your ass back in the 60s, you would stop whatever it was you were doing. And that was the whole point. So it was about intimidation. It was about being associated with known criminals like the Black Panther Party. And the arrests themselves, the daily arrests, were part of that technique as well. Not only did they want to deplete the coffers of the Black Panther Party in, because they had to bail everybody out or pay for the legal fees of those people arrested on trumped up charges or misdemeanors or things like that, but just the sheer repetition of being arrested every day and having to put out that money. But it was also this, the signal that this is what happens to you if you hang out with these people. This is what happens to you if you go to one of their programs. So even if you have a small, school aged child and you simply wanted to provide them breakfast before they went to school and went to one of the churches or one of the locations that the Black Panther Party had the Breakfast for Children program, you would be swept up in that net too, and that could be used against you to forcibly persuade you to not have anything more to do with the Black Panther Party. So you asked, though, who was initiating such a plan to take Fred Hampton out? I think that it did not have to be a coordinated effort. I think each of them tried to do what they could do, given where Fred Hampton was, given how smart he was, given how mature he was. So the intelligence division of the Chicago Police Department, or what we call today the Red Squad, was initially supposed to raid his apartment, not the Chicago police. And of course, it wasn't the Chicago police; it was the state's attorney's office. They had a little unit within the state's attorney's office called the Special Prosecutions Unit, and these were police officers who were detailed to that office. But they were ultimately the ones who conducted the raid on Fred Hampton's apartment in December of 1969. So I think it was just a cooperation and interagency cooperation, because they have been surveilling this young man since 1966. So the last, 3 years of his life, day in and day out, he is being surveilled. His mail is being opened. His mother's phone, the home telephone. He lived with his mother until October of 69. Her phone was tapped. They were being photographed. They were being recorded. They were being infiltrated by agent provocateurs and other informants. It wasn't just the FBI. It was the military intelligence group, the 113th Military Intelligence Group stationed in Evanston. It was also did I say the state's attorney's office? Yeah. So all of these agencies found the Black Panther Party and Fred Hampton threatening enough to the status quo to surveil him every day for 3 years until they killed him.
When it came to his death, the night they raided his house and 120 shots were fired, and I think only one bullet was attributed to the Black Panthers, which was an accidental shot that was fired. It was obviously over abuse or overpower of whatever they want to call whatever their version of sick justice, I would say. But weren't they making a documentary when that happened about Fred Hampton's life, and they kind of switched it over after the assassination of him, and they filmed his house and kind of walked through to end the documentary?
Yes, luckily there was a film crew in Chicago, and had been since they started in 1968, late 1968. It's called the Film Group Inc. And Mike Gray was one the principal. I don't know if he was the actual if he actually filmed it, or if he was one of the producers and directors. But they had already mentioned the Black Panther Party, or profiled the Black Panther Party in its infancy, in covering the Democratic Convention of 1968 in a documentary called American Revolution 2. So, but Mike Gray was so taken with this young leader, Fred Hampton, who was, as you had already mentioned, a phenomenal orator, much like Malcolm X was able to speak to any kind of audience. He was able to change his diction to fit whatever audience he was speaking to. And Fred Hampton was, well, he was, for a lack of a better term, he was a star. That when people wanted to hear about the Black Panther Party, wanted a speaker at their event, they wanted Fred Hampton. Of course, he couldn't be at three places at once, so other Black Panther Party members um, filled in. But Fred was the one they wanted. Fred was the one that was on the radio. He was on television. He was the one that they wanted. Then I've just completely lost my train. What
You're talking
you
about
asked?
the documentary.
Yeah, the documentary. So at the time of the raid on his apartment, um, 14 police officers from the state's attorney's office were armed. Each of them were armed with 2 to 3 weapons apiece. And they were allowed to bring personal weapons from home if they wanted, not just their service revolvers. Everyone had their service revolvers, but they brought an additional either revolver, shotgun, or they also had a submachine gun. And 8 of them um, actually entered the apartment. One from one group from the back door that was in the kitchen, and the front door which was in the foyer. Um, and they converged on the center of the apartment, which is where 9 people were staying at that point. And the result of it was Fred Hampton was killed, shot no less than 5 times. Mark Clark, who was the leader of the Peoria branch in Illinois, was up from Peoria for a couple of weeks and staying with Hampton. 4 other people were wounded, and the rest were arrested for attempted murder, as you said. Even though only 1 shot could ballistically be matched to any of the Panther weapons that were in the apartment. So it was not a shoot out; it was in fact a shoot in. The Panthers didn't have any time, it was 4:30 in the morning, and of course that the state's attorney's office claims that was exactly why they decided to do a 4:30 in the morning, to take them by surprise, so they would have least resistance. Well, he got that right, but for the press, because we have to continue to demonize the Black Panther Party, they said that they were immediately met with gunfire. And after telling the occupants of the apartment several times to stop fire, to halt the fire, they continued to. They said, shoot it out, shoot it out. Of course, that's fiction. It didn't happen. We can scientifically establish that. So Mike Gray had started filming Fred and the Black Panther Party, I think in like January or February of '69. Like I said, in the infancy of the chapter of the Illinois Black Panther Party, and wanted to do a documentary on that, focusing on Fred, but of course including everybody in the party. Now, he was he was filming up until May, and it was in May that Fred was convicted of and sent to prison for his alleged stealing of 510 ice cream bars and distributing them to the children of Maywood.
They pissed on the ice cream, Craig. They pissed on the ice cream.
Yep, and they gave him 2 to 5 years, even though he didn't have a record. Now, he had been arrested several times before, but of course, all of those were successfully negotiated, and charges were dismissed, because Fred was the go-to guy. Whenever shit went down in Maywood or the surrounding areas, blame it on Fred, because he was the leader, right? Whether you're talking about the youth leader of the NAACP, or he was just the leader of the youth in Maywood. If some shit went down, it was Fred Hampton's fault. But of course, none of those charges stuck. The only thing they could ever get Fred on, not sedition, not gun charges, but stealing ice cream, and he got 2 to 5 years for it. Anyway, he started his prison sentence in late May and got out mid-August, right before his 21st birthday. So obviously they couldn't film much while Fred was in prison, but and they were continuing to film up until the assassination. One of the Panthers' lawyers, his name was Skip Andrews, he asked Mike the morning of the raid to come into the apartment and film it in its original condition, because the Chicago police, the state's attorney's office, and their crime lab had abandoned the apartment. Once everyone was loaded into the meat wagons and the paddy wagons, they didn't want to stay there. They didn't want to deal with what was obviously going to be a severe community backlash. You all right?
I have a question.
Okay.
Uh,
Yeah.
you never wanted to steal an ice cream before? I'd cut a bitch over like a nice SpongeBob popsicle.
Now, for me, it would have to be a good humor toasted almond bar.
Oh, damn, I didn't even think of that one.
Yeah, but not 510 of them. That's for damn sure. Maybe one.
I could kill 510 of them easy.
So because the law enforcement officers abandoned a crime scene, Skip Andrews really wanted to make sure that the apartment was the evidence in the apartment, the condition of the apartment was preserved on film, because the police ransacked the place. I've spoken to many tactical officers over the years, and I've asked them, okay, so if you go in, if you have a search warrant for something, you break in, scuffles, obviously a fight ensues, and it becomes a crime scene because someone's killed. What do you do then? And he says, well, without disturbing any of the scene, you still have an obligation to confiscate whatever it was the search warrant says you can. But from the moment that someone is killed, it becomes a crime scene. So you have to do everything you can to preserve that. You can't ransack the place. You can't look for anything you want. You can't overturn stuff. A crime happened. Whether or not you're culpable in that crime, whether or not the cops committed that crime, it doesn't matter. So they should have treated it as a crime scene and immediately sealed off the apartment. Of course, they didn't. The coroner of Cook County did not seal Fred Hampton's apartment until December 17th. So 2 weeks after the assassination, that's when they sealed the apartment. But in the interim, after Mike Gray had filmed the apartment, after an independent ballistics expert by the name of Herbert McDonald went in and did a ballistics test and collected some evidence, the Black Panther Party, through no fault of their own, I'm not gonna get on them too much for this, but they conducted daily tours through Fred Hampton's apartment, like right through into the front door, through the apartment, out the back door. Hundreds of them every single day. So people were there. They could have picked up, and probably did pick up, numerous casings or slugs or cartridges or fragments or any souvenirs they possibly could. So that by the time the coroner actually put a seal on the apartment, it had been the crime scene had been so desiccated, it wouldn't have legally been relevant. It wouldn't have mattered at that point. Any search that the crime lab, the CPD crime lab, or anyone else did in that apartment, it wouldn't have. I don't even think it would have been admissible in evidence,
I don't.
because it had been so contaminated.
I think it really shows about our legal system when something like that happens. I think if you look at the message that it sends to the people compared to the message that the legal system would get out of it, I think the best chance was letting the people see the horrible disaster for themselves. I mean, you have to think of every person that could have been a possible person that picked up a casing or something like that. That's something that goes on a necklace. It goes on in their house. They look at it, and every day they're reminded of an incident where obviously police force was used, and in a way that was 100% unethical and unreasoned, it was unprovoked.
Absolutely, absolutely. So yeah, so we don't know, we can't know specifically how many shots were fired, because here's the other kicker, is that when the officers assembled prior to the raid and got all of their munitions together, they checked out ammunition from whatever they call it, the ammo locker at the CPD. We don't have an accurate count of what they took or what they returned, because they did not immediately give up their weapons, the weapons that they used in the raid, for ballistic study. It was several days later that they did that, but they basically just threw shit in a box. Whatever was used up, they threw it in a box, and that was that. So there was no way to determine whose bullets came from what gun, so forth and so on. I mean, based on the gun, obviously, but they all had 38s. That was the one thing. Um, but it was absolute mess, and not all of the officers' guns can be accounted for, and not all of the ammunition that they used or could have used has been accounted for. So we really don't know how many shots. Actually, one of the officers said if the shootout was 500 shots and lasted 10 minutes, I wouldn't be surprised. Well, that's pretty funny, because that's 500, 499 for the police and one for the Panthers. It's even worse than we imagined, and in fact it was. The part in the Murder of Fred Hampton, which is half of Fred Hampton speaking and some of the things that they did as an organization, then becomes an evidentiary video of the apartment and the police's reconstruction of the raid. They put tape on a big floor, and it was televised. It was filmed for television, because only the police officers' version of the events were going to be, amplified like that. These kind of things are the second half of the documentary called the Murder of Fred Hampton. But when Mike Gray first gets there, and Skip Andrews is picking stuff up, when Fred was shot to death in his bed, they then went over to his bed, took him by his wrist because he was on his stomach. So took him by his left wrist and dragged him off his bed onto the floor and into the doorway between the dining room and Fred Hampton's bedroom. And so he laid across that doorway. Now the door had fallen over because they didn't use a door for the actual bedroom. They used it to keep rats from getting into the kitchen. So it was laid across where the kitchen is, and during the raid, it had fallen over on the floor, and that's what they dragged Fred onto. So when Mike Gray gets into the apartment, there are posters and newspapers on the door. He lifts them up, and they're just stuck with Fred Hampton's blood. And so it's this morbid, sickening peeling of this blood-soaked paper until finally he lifts up the door to show the blood stains, and it very sickening, actually. But that's exactly what he wanted Mike Gray to be able to document: is the viciousness, the complete and utter destruction of walls, paint cans, furniture, but also human beings. Blood trails, blood. Fred Hampton's blood-soaked mattress. But it was very important. It was sickening, and it was very disturbing to watch, but it was necessary because we wouldn't have captured this otherwise. We would never have known the extent.
From your view as a historian, and you kind of start looking into this and how a lot of this doesn't get talked about in our history books, either if it's the JFK assassination, MLK assassination, RFK assassination, Fred Hampton's assassination, Sam Cooke's assassination, if you want. There's plenty of other ones out there that you can really point at that land in this. So when you hear all this and you see all this and you know all this and it's not being taught and you're trying to understand, and whenever you do, like you talking to me now, I'm with you. I understand because I've known it and I've looked into it as well too from other guests and things of that sort. But for an average person, either they just look, they go, "This is too much," and they turn it off, or they roll their eyes and say conspiracy because they don't want the world to be that dark, but it is. And if we don't talk about it and if we don't recognize our history, then you get into this area where it just keeps repeating itself.
Absolutely. We've had um, just morbidly ugly times in our history, and just because we don't look at them doesn't mean they didn't happen. And like you said, if we don't look at them and don't recognize the inhumanity, then we will do it again, and we won't recognize it when it's shown again. Whether we're talking about culpability of our intelligence agencies in something they've done or something they're covering up, the lack of transparency in our government, all of these things, we have to be able to see the signs of them from years past. And yes, we see a pattern of political assassinations in the 1960s and 70s. And while the motivation might not be political, certainly the consequence of these deaths were political. So um, it is absolutely imperative that we look for these patterns, especially when it's intelligence agencies who are claiming that they are protecting the majority of Americans from these threats. Of course, they never tell you what the threats are. Conservatives, Republicans, intelligence agencies throughout the years, they have loved to create bogeymen, but never describing it to you, never telling you what it came from or how it arrived or how it got here. Nothing specific about it, just what to be afraid of. And what you're supposed to be afraid of in the 1960s are angry Black people, right? And so you demonize them. You say, well, look at that. They have guns. Yeah, they have guns. The same guns that you now claim 60 years later is your constitutional God-given right to carry. Unless, of course, back in the 60s, you were Black. Then you can't carry a gun. Oh, we got to change the laws. That was one of the very first things that the National Black Panther Party confronted was it was founded in October of 66, and by May of 67, because the Black Panther Party decided to pick up the gun and embrace the philosophy of Robert Williams and Malcolm X and self-defense, following the law though, because the guns were legally purchased. Anybody who was on probation couldn't have a gun. They didn't. So they were not just, you know, members of a Black liberation, Black nationalist / Marxist leanings group. They were also very well steeped in the law because they did not want to give the cops any more reason to take away their rights or put them in jail or, like we're confronted with now, killing them over nothing. So they tried to change the laws in California simply because the Black Panther Party decided to legally pick up the gun in defense of their actions, which of course were community based. We are trying to protect people from the cops. And that doesn't seem so far-fetched nowadays, does it? To have to police the police. Gee, I've heard that before. But anyway, that was certainly in the 1960s. But the patterns of the different kinds of people who were assassinated throughout those 10 years, it's mind-boggling from somebody, people as seemingly docile like Medgar Evers or Martin Luther King. Actually, Martin Luther King wasn't quite as docile as he's made out to be, but it makes for an easier national holiday. To the more militant and radical, like Malcolm X and Fred Hampton, or any of the other 30-some Black Panther Party members who were killed within their tenure. You look at the patterns of what was being affected by their deaths. How was the status quo in fact affected by their deaths? How did things change? How did things stay the same? And you look at those patterns and those elements, and it's no wonder we do not have a whole lot of confidence left in the government or in their investigative bodies when they say that they are investigating something. And I'm talking about even contemporarily, like either 9/11 or the Iran-Contra scandal, or even the Challenger shuttle explosion. That was so completely mishandled. So something as benign of a national tragedy, something that couldn't have been foreseen, but it turns out it could have been foreseen. So we just have to remain vigilant in looking at some of the more ugly things in life. Maybe that's why we're apathetic about homeless people or people who are hungry, or people who are trapped in the criminal justice system because they can't afford bail or they can't afford a lawyer or what have you, or because what they were initially arrested for and incarcerated for is no longer illegal. So that's unfortunately where we find ourselves. Is some of the ugliness, even today, that more and more larger part of society doesn't want to look at, don't want to talk about it in high school, don't want to talk about, so don't want to talk about it in schools. So it's not enough not to talk about it. Now we're going to also ban books that make us uncomfortable, or show how discriminatory we've been and how much we continue to be. Um, yeah, so I urge everybody to be vigilant, because democracy is participatory, and ensuring our rights is not going to come about by um, being apathetic.
Craig, where can people find your links, man? I really appreciate you giving me the time to talk on my show.
The appreciation is all mine. And my schematic and my list, the map and list of the eyewitnesses, can be found on craigciccone.wordpress.com, and you can order that through there, and see. And I have a picture of the schematic and the book, and talk about what's inside the book. Um, I have not yet created anything that's online about Fred Hampton, but I plan to in the upcoming months. I would like to do a thorough review, not review, a critique of Judas and the Black Messiah, the Shaka King film that came out last year. Not because I think that Hollywood should be criticized every time they do a historical drama, right? Uh, because we all have movies that we enjoy watching that we know are historically inaccurate. Whether it's Tucker, whether it's the Buddy Holly story, whether
The
it's
new
Malcolm.
MK Ultra film is a fucking travesty.
Well, so all these films, we know the trappings of Hollywood, and that they want to try to appeal to people on a broad level as possible. So we make it as um, consumptive as possible. The most amount of people will watch this because, it's only 2 hours or a little over 2 hours, and it's a love story. It's a good guy, bad guy kind of thing, where you actually, I think King's purpose was to, at the end of the movie, feel sorry for William O'Neill, which is preposterous. But I simply want to give people the alternate to the movie. This is what the movie portrays, but this is what actually happened, without saying, well, Shaka King shouldn't have done that, or shouldn't have casted that person, or shouldn't have, made this composite character, or no. Because I know that Shaka King isn't an historian, and Judas and the Black Messiah is not a documentary. I simply want to give people that alternative. Uh, this is what actually happened in comparison. So when you watch Judas and the Black Messiah, you can at least, if you want to, have an understanding of what actually happened, and who the players were, and why it happened. I would like to do that on a blog, and I'm probably going to do that within the next few months. But of course, with your generosity, and you making these subjects part of the consciousness, I think that you'll be able to help me put up a new link if I create more stuff. I mean, I'm also doing a database on Robert Kennedy's eyewitnesses and his assassination. So as I create things, I'm sure you will add the links as I create them.
I'm gonna watch the Judas and Black Messiah movie, and I'm gonna have you and Jeffrey Haas on here so I can talk to you about the movie, and you can tell me what was wrong about it and what was improper about it.
Well, some of the more egregious things, and I would be honored to watch it, or to talk about it with Jeffrey Haas, given that he was one of the main players in the civil trial that was brought against the survivors of the raid. I mean, he's an important historical figure, and has a really unique perspective on Fred Hampton, the Black Panther Party, and of course the FBI and the criminal justice system. Um, but I'd be really curious as to what he thought of the film, because Shaka King he did not consult. Well, there have only been two people who have written about Fred Hampton, and the books weren't specifically about Fred Hampton. Haas wrote about Fred Hampton's assassination and the civil trial itself, and Jacoby Williams, who wrote Bullet or the Ballot. It was a history of the Illinois Black Panther Party. Obviously, Fred played predominantly in that book, but it was not about Fred Hampton. So there's been no book written about Fred Hampton. But Shaka King didn't consult Jacoby Williams, never consulted Jeffrey Haas, probably read their books and based things in the movie on it, but of course never gave them credit for it. So in watching the film, I'm surprised that they got so much wrong that they wouldn't have gotten wrong if they had just done the bare minimum of research into Fred Hampton and the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. But they didn't. So,
Well, I'm
but
gonna
I,
link. I'm about to say I'm gonna link all your links in the description. I'll have to set it up. I don't want to say anything because I don't want to plan a date yet, but
oh,
I'll
I'm
set.
just, but you want to get your listeners really, excited about that prospect.
uh, Craig, it's been a pleasure chatting with you again,
It
man. And
really has, Robbie. Thank you so much for your time.
I'm gonna link all your links in the description. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode.